The day my husband told me he wanted a divorce. He was wearing the tie I'd given him for his birthday. I remember staring at it the whole time he talked. The deep burgundy silk. The small gold pattern along the edge, because looking at his face was something I couldn't do. "You've become someone I don't recognize," he said. Not angry, tired. Like I was a problem he'd been putting off solving for too long. We were sitting at the kitchen table. The same table where I'd helped our daughter with her homework every night for 7 years. The same table where we'd had Christmas breakfast. Where I'd signed her school permission forms. Where I'd eaten alone more nights than I could count while he worked late. I didn't cry. I think that surprised him. I just asked, "Is there someone else?" He didn't answer right away. That was answer enough. Her name was Simone. I found out later from his sister, who has the decency to look ashamed when she told me. Simone worked at his firm, 29 years old. And, his sister said this part quietly, like it would soften it. I was 38. We had a daughter, Ren, who was 9. I had spent the last decade working part-time as a bookkeeper so I could be home when Ren got off the school bus. I had built my entire life around this family, and in the space of one Tuesday afternoon, I found out it had been crumbling for at least 2 years without me knowing. The divorce proceedings took 4 months. In Canada, 4 months feels both very fast and very, very slow, depending on which side of the table you're sitting on. My husband, I'll call him my ex-husband now, which still felt strange to say out loud that first year, had a lawyer. I had a lawyer too, a woman named Patricia who wore sensible shoes and had a reputation for being unmovable. I liked her immediately. The settlement was fair. Our house in Burlington was sold and split. He paid child support. In Ontario, you don't negotiate that. The federal child support guidelines calculate it, and that's what you pay, period. I got primary custody of Ren. He got alternate weekends and every second holiday. What nobody tells you about divorce is the strange, hollow feeling of suddenly having a life that fits in boxes. I packed up 9 years of shared space into a storage unit and rented a 2-bedroom apartment in Hamilton while I figured out what came next. Ren took it better than I expected. Kids are resilient in ways that make you feel guilty for falling apart in front of them. She asked me once, about 3 weeks after we moved, "Mom, are you going to be okay?" And she asked it so seriously, sitting cross-legged on her new bed with its SpongeBob duvet, that I had to work very hard not to cry. "Yes," I said, "we both are." I believed it, mostly. What I didn't tell her was what I'd already been quietly building for the past 3 years. Because here's the thing about being a bookkeeper, even a part-time one, is that you understand money. You understand where it goes and where it doesn't. And I had watched our household finances for a long time. Watched the small irregularities that my ex had assumed I was too busy or too distracted to notice. I had started my own account in 2021. Nothing dramatic. Small transfers, freelance contracts I'd picked up through a former colleague, a few investments that had done quietly, steadily well. By the time I signed the divorce papers, I had just over $47,000 sitting in an account my ex didn't know existed and had never been mentioned in any of our joint financial disclosures, because legally, it had always been mine alone. It wasn't about hiding it from him. It was about knowing, somewhere deep and instinctive, that I needed something that was just for me. That money was what made what happened next possible. My younger sister lived in Vancouver. She'd been calling me every few days since the separation. And one Sunday evening in March, she said, "Come here, just for a few months. Get out of Ontario. You need air." I'd been thinking about it already. My freelance bookkeeping work was fully remote. Ren's school year ended in June. There was nothing anchoring me to Hamilton except the storage unit and a gym membership I kept forgetting to cancel. So I called Ren's school, sorted out a leave of absence, arranged for my sister to help me find a short-term rental, and in the first week of July, Ren and I flew to Vancouver with 4 suitcases and what felt like approximately zero plan, and also somehow the lightest I'd felt in years. My sister lived in a townhouse in East Van with her partner and their 2 dogs. She'd found us a furnished 1-bedroom suite in the same neighborhood, a 10-minute walk from her place. The landlady was a retired teacher named Barbara who left homemade muffins on the doorstep the day we arrived. I stood in the little entryway holding a muffin and almost cried, which tells you a lot about what state I was in. Ren loved Vancouver immediately. She loved the mountains. She loved that the ocean was only a 20-minute drive. She made friends with the kids next door within 48 hours because children are extraordinary at that. At just walking up to strangers and saying, "Do you want to play?" without any of the armor that adults grow over the years. I spent the first week sleeping. Genuinely, I would drop Ren at my sister's, come back to the suite, and sleep until noon. I hadn't realized how exhausted I was. Not just from the divorce, but from years of performing fine. Years of keeping every plate spinning. Years of being competent and capable and okay when I wasn't any of those things. In the second week, I started working again. Remote bookkeeping, a few new clients I'd picked up through referrals. I set up my laptop at the kitchen table in the morning and worked for a few hours while Ren was at day camp. Then we'd spend the afternoons together. Seawall walks, beach days, the science museum, the aquarium once, which she talked about for 2 weeks straight. It was during that second week that I got the call from my ex's sister. I want to say something about her. She wasn't a bad person. She'd always been kind to me, even when her brother wasn't. When everything fell apart, she'd been the one to tell me about Simone. And I think she'd done that because she felt I deserved to know. We hadn't spoken much since the divorce finalized, but she still texted on Ren's birthday, and she'd sent a card when we moved. She called on a Wednesday afternoon. I was sitting on the little balcony with a cup of tea. "I thought you should know," she said. And her voice had that quality again, that careful gentleness she used when she was about to say something difficult. "Simone had her prenatal appointment yesterday, the one where they do the full genetic screening." I didn't say anything. I waited. "She's due in November," she continued. But at the appointment, there was something with the blood work. A chromosomal marker. The doctor was explaining what it might mean, and then asked about family medical history. Both sides. She paused, and that's when the whole thing started to unravel. She told me the rest in pieces, the way you tell someone news that's both shocking and, in some terrible way, almost logical. The genetic counselor had asked about paternal family history. Simone had given the information. But the counselor had flagged something, the blood type results, combined with the carrier markers, and had asked a series of questions that had led inexorably to one conclusion. The baby's blood type was impossible given the paternal blood type Simone had listed, which meant the information she'd given was wrong. Which meant, and my ex had figured this out, sitting there in a clinic waiting room in Oakville, listening to a genetic counselor speak very carefully and professionally about biological impossibilities, that the baby was not his. I sat on my balcony in Vancouver, and the mountains in the distance, and didn't say a word for a long time. "He's not taking it well," his sister said. "No," I said. "I don't imagine he is." She asked how I was. I told her I was fine. And I meant it more than I had in a long time. Here's what I didn't feel, which surprised me. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated in some satisfying cinematic way. What I felt was tired. And then, very slowly, something that I think was close to peace. Because the story I'd been telling myself for 4 months, the story where I wasn't enough, where I was too boring, too predictable, too settled, where I had somehow failed to be interesting enough for the life I'd built, that story fell apart in that moment. He hadn't left me for someone extraordinary. He'd left me for someone who had lied to him, possibly from the very beginning, who had presented him with a pregnancy and let him believe it was his, who had in fact been involved with someone else entirely. I wasn't the failure in this story. I poured out the rest of my tea and went inside to start dinner for Ren. The following weeks were quiet in Vancouver. Ren finished day camp and we spent August the way you spend the best Augusts, slowly, outside without particular agenda. My sister and her partner took us to Whistler for a weekend. We hiked part of the Garibaldi Trail, and Ren complained about her feet for 45 minutes, and then announced at the top that it was the best thing she'd ever done, which is a very accurate description of being 9 years old. My ex called once, not to talk about Simone or the genetic appointment or any of it, to ask a logistical question about Ren's health card, something that needed to be updated. He sounded like himself but smaller somehow, like he'd been deflated. I answered the question, confirmed the information, and that was that. What I was actually thinking about, those August weeks, was what came next. Not in an anxious way, more in the way you think about a crossroads when you're finally standing, still long enough to look at it properly. My lease in Hamilton still had 4 months. I was working well, sleeping well, feeling better than I had in years. Ren had adjusted to Vancouver beautifully. My sister kept saying, "Just stay," every time I mentioned going back. I started looking at the numbers. Not emotionally, but the way I look at numbers professionally, carefully, factually, without wishful thinking. My remote income had actually increased since moving. 3 new clients in 2 months. The suite rental was cheaper than my Hamilton apartment. Ren could transfer to a local school in September if we decided to stay. My sister was here, which mattered more to me than I'd acknowledged. The Hamilton storage unit, full of furniture from our old house, had been costing me $180 a month since April. I sold almost everything in it in a single weekend, through Facebook Marketplace and a call to a consignment shop. Kept what mattered. Let the rest go. That Monday, I called Barbara, the landlady, and asked if she'd consider a 6-month extension on the suite. She said yes before I'd finished the sentence. Ren started grade 4 at a school 12 blocks from the suite in September. By the end of the first week, she knew the names of 6 kids in her class and had been invited to a birthday party. I walked her home on the Friday and she talked the entire way, and I thought, this is it. This is what right feels like. The thing about rebuilding your life is that it doesn't happen the way movies suggest. In a montage, with a good soundtrack, with clear narrative beats of low and high. It happens in the grocery store, when you realize you've been standing in front of the cereal for 3 minutes, thinking about something other than what you lost. It happens in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, when you finish a report for a client and realize you're proud of the work. It happens when your daughter falls asleep on the couch watching TV, and you sit there in the dim room and feel genuinely okay. I joined a bookkeeping network in Vancouver that fall, started picking up more local clients, met a woman through the network, Vera, who ran a small accounting firm and was looking for a part-time contractor. We had coffee at a place on Commercial Drive, and by the end of it she'd offered me more work than I could reasonably take on, so we negotiated, and I ended up with a consistent arrangement that paid better than anything I'd had in Burlington. I wasn't thinking about my ex. I wasn't thinking about Simone or the genetic appointment, or what had happened to their relationship. I'd heard, through his sister, that they were no longer together, that the whole thing had ended badly, and that he was now in a 1-bedroom apartment in Mississauga, trying to figure out what he'd done to his life. I didn't dwell on that. Not out of graciousness, exactly, just because it had stopped mattering the way it once had. What mattered was the Thursday pickup from school, where Ren ran out the front doors and showed me a story she'd written in language arts class. A story about a girl who moved to a new city and found a dragon living under the community center, and the dragon was grumpy at first but eventually became the girl's best friend because the girl kept bringing it muffins. The teacher had written, "Wonderful imagination," in the margin in red pen. What mattered was the message from my mother in Winnipeg, saying she was coming to visit in October, and could she take Ren to the aquarium? Because Ren had told her about the belugas 17 times. What mattered was that the storage unit was gone, the Hamilton apartment lease had ended, and every single thing in my life was exactly where I'd put it. In November, I got an email from my ex's lawyer, not about custody. Those arrangements were working fine, but about the house sale proceeds from Burlington, a small discrepancy in the final statement of adjustments that his lawyer had identified, and mine had confirmed was real. There was a check owed to me. About $1,400, a miscalculation in the property tax prorations. I replied, via my lawyer, confirming the figure and the transfer information. When the money landed in my account a few days later, I transferred $400 to Ren's RESP. She already had a solid start in there. I'd been contributing since she was born, and the government grant match was something I'd never once let lapse, not even in the difficult years. By the time she was ready for post-secondary, she'd have options, real options, the kind that don't depend on anyone else. That felt like justice. Not the dramatic cinematic kind, the real kind. One evening in December, my sister came over for dinner and we were sitting at the kitchen table after Ren had gone to bed, drinking tea, and she asked me how I was. Really was. I thought about it for a moment. Actually thought about it rather than reflexively saying fine. I'm good, I said. I think I'm actually good. She looked at me for a second and then nodded like she'd been waiting a while to hear it. You know what I keep thinking? She said. You left Burlington with 4 suitcases and no plan, and you just built it. You just quietly built a whole new life. I had a plan, I said. It was just a small one, she laughed. What was the plan? Keep Ren safe. Keep working, stop apologizing. She raised her mug. That's a pretty good plan. It was. It turned out it was enough. Ren is 10 now. She has a best friend named Zoe who lives 2 blocks away. She's in a choir that meets Wednesday afternoons, and she takes swimming lessons on Saturday mornings, and she still talks about the belugas, and when she talks about Vancouver, she says home, without thinking about it, the same easy way she used to say Burlington, which tells me everything I need to know. I sometimes think about the woman I was at that kitchen table in Burlington, staring at a burgundy tie, and trying not to look at the face of someone I'd loved for a decade. I don't think of her with pity. She made the best decisions she could with what she had. She kept her head down and kept things running and stored up quietly, steadily, the resources she needed for a moment she hoped would never come. The moment came anyway, and she was ready.